Hey everybody, welcome back to Alive and Thriving. I'm Nathaniel J. and I'm reading from Life and Teachings of the Masters of the Far East. I'm going to dive right into chapter 19, so without further ado, here we go. We had asked one of the attendants to call us at the first sign of daybreak, and almost before I knew it, there came a rap at the door. We all bounded out of bed, so eager were we to see the first break of day from our lofty perch. We were dressed in no time and went rushing out onto the roof like three eager schoolboys. In fact, the noises we made so startled the attendants that they rushed up to see if we were really in our right minds. I suspect the noise the three of us made was more noise than had ever disturbed the peaceful quiet of the old temple since the days it was built, and this we learned was more than 10,000 years ago. In fact, it was so old it looked a part of the rock upon which it rested. When we arrived on the roof, there was no need to ask for quiet. One look, and my two associates' eyes and mouths were wide open. I suspect, had anyone looked at mine, they would have seen the same. I waited for them to speak. Almost in one breath came the exclamation, "Why? We are surely suspended in midair." They said with the sensation. They said the sensation was exactly like that I had experienced in the other temple. They had forgotten for a moment that there was anything under the feet, and the sensation was that they were floating in midair. One remarked, "I do not wonder that these men can fly after experiencing this." We were aroused from our reveries by a laugh, and all turned to find Emil, Jast, and our friend of the record standing close behind. One of my associates walked quickly up to them, tried to grasp all of their hands at once, and said, "This is wonderful! We do not wonder you are able to fly after you have been here for a time." They smiled, and one said, "You are free to fly as well. You only need to know that you have the power within to do so, then use that power." When we turned to the outlook, the fog had lowered and we were floating in great billowy waves just high enough so that not a foot of land could be seen anywhere in the movement of the banks of fog all around gave the sensation that we were being carried on noiseless wings along with the fog. Standing there looking far out, one lost sense of anything underfoot, and it was very difficult to believe that we were not floating in space. As I looked out, it seemed as if my body lost all sense of weight and that I was actually floating above the roof. I had so far forgotten myself that when one of the party spoke, my feet hit the roof with such a force that I felt the effects of the jar for several days after. At breakfast that morning, we decided to stay over for 3 days, as we expected to visit only one other place of interest before going on to the appointed meeting place. Upon reading the messages Emil had brought, we learned that our chief's party had visited this temple only 3 days before. After breakfast, we went out and found the fog gradually clearing. We watched it until it cleared entirely and the sun came up. We could see the little village nestling close in under the cliff and the valley far below. Our friends decided to visit the village, and we asked if we might go with them. They laughed and said we could, but they thought we had better use the basket, as we would present a better appearance if we did than if we attempted their mode of travel. So we lowered one by one to the ledge, then down to the little plateau just above the village. No sooner had the last one stepped from the basket than our friends were there. We went down to the village and spent the greater part of the day. If you're wondering what I'm doing with my mouth, I have seeds apparently stuck in my teeth. It was a quaint old place, typical of those mountain districts with its houses built by digging into the side of the cliff, then closing up the opening with rock walls. There were in all about 20 of these houses. We were told that the houses were built in this manner to keep from being crushed by the heavy snows in the winter. The villagers soon began to gather, and Emil talked to them for a few moments. It was arranged that a meeting should be held the following afternoon, and couriers were sent out to notify those of the neighborhood who wished to attend. We were told that John the Baptist had lived at this village and received instruction in the temple, and that the temple remained the same as when John received his instruction there. We were shown where the house had been torn down. That afternoon, when we returned to the temple, the weather had cleared so that we could see a wide expanse of country, and we were shown the trail that John had used in going to and from the temple, and the different villages where he lived. The temple was supposed to have been built and the village established more than 6,000 years before John visited there. We were shown the trail we would take, and when we departed, we were told the trail had been in use since the temple was built. About 5 o'clock that afternoon, our friend of the records said he would leave us for a time. He then shook hands, saying he would see us soon, and he disappeared. That evening, we saw the most remarkable sunset from the roof of the temple that I have ever witnessed, and it has been my good fortune to have seen sunsets in nearly all lands. As evening advanced, a light haze was gathering over a low range of mountains that bordered a wide expanse of tablelands which we could look down upon. When the sun reached this rim, we were seemingly so far above it that it appeared as if we were looking directly down upon a sea of molten gold. Then came the afternoon glow, the afterglow, and every mountain peak appeared to be aflame. There in the distance that we covered, those in the distance that were covered with snow seemed to be blanketed with fire, and where glaciers filled the ravines, it appeared as though they were shooting forth great tongues of fire, and these flames appeared to meet and melt with the different hues in the heavens. The lakes that dotted the plain below were transformed suddenly into volcanoes belching forth fires, which ascended and blended with the colors in the heavens. For a moment, it seemed as if we were standing on the brink of a silent inferno. Then all blended into one harmony of color, and the soft, peaceful quiet was beyond description. We sat on the roof until after 12 that night, asking Emil and Jast questions. These questions pertained particularly to the people and the history of the country in general. Emil quoted liberally from their records. These records proved that this country, who was inhabited thousands of years before our history began. Emil went on to say, "While I do not in any way wish to disparage or make light of your history or of those who wrote it, I will say that at the beginning of this history, the historians did not go back far enough, but took for granted that Egypt meant what the name implied, outer darkness or the wilderness. It really meant a wilderness of thought. At that time, as now, a large portion of the world was in wilderness of thought, and they did not go back of it to get the deeper meaning. They accepted what they saw or heard or what appeared on the surface. They recorded it, and your history then began. It is quite difficult to correlate the two, and I would not attempt to say that you must take ours as authentic. I would suggest that you choose for yourself. The moon then appeared over the far-off mountains. We sat and watched it round and full until it rose nearly overhead. It was a beautiful sight, with an occasional light cloud passing by at an elevation just above us. When these clouds went drifting by, it seemed as if the moon and clouds were standing still and we were drifting past them. This went on for an hour, when suddenly there was a noise as of some object thrown to the roof behind us. We started to our feet and looked around. There stood a middle-aged lady smiling and asking if she had startled us. Our first impression was that she had jumped from the parapet to the roof, but she had only stamped her foot to attract our attention. The stillness had been so intense, We had greatly magnified the sound. Emil stepped forward quickly, greeted her, and introduced us to his sister. She smiled and asked whether she had intruded on our dreams. We then sat down, and in a short time the conversation drifted into reminiscence of her past experiences. She has 3 sons and a daughter that had been raised in the work. She replied that the youngest 2 were always with her. We asked if we might meet them. She replied that they could come there that evening, and immediately 2 figures, a man and a woman, appeared. They greeted their uncle and their mother, then came forward and were introduced to the 3 of us. The son was a tall, erect, manly fellow, whom we took to be about 30 years of age. The daughter was not tall, rather slight, with very fine features. She 20 years of age. After we found that the son was 115 and the daughter was 128. They were all to be present at the meeting the next day and soon went below. After they had retired, we passed complimentary remarks about the son and daughter. The mother turned to us and said, "Every child born is good and perfect. There are no bad children. It does not matter whether they are conceived in the perfect or immaculate, or through the sense or material way. The one conceived in the perfect way will soon realize his sonship with the Father, that he is the Christ, or Son of God, that he will develop and unfold quickly, and he will see only perfection. The one convinced through the sense we may also immediately recognize, the one conceived through the sense may also immediately recognize his sonship, perceive that the Christ is in him, and may realize his perfection by idealizing the Christ. He gazes upon that ideal, loves and cherishes it until he manifests or brings forth that which he gazes upon, the Christ. He is reborn and is perfect. He has brought forth perfection from within himself. That perfection which was always there. The one held to the ideal and was perfect. The other perceived the ideal and unfolded that ideal and regained perfection. Thus no child is bad. All are good and from God. Here, one of the party suggested that it was bedtime, as it was past 12 o'clock. Thus ends the reading of the life and the teachings of the Masters of the Far East, chapter 19. Chapter 20. 5 o'clock the next morning found us all assembled on the roof of the temple. After the regular morning's greetings, we gathered around and, as is the usual custom, a selection was read. The selection this morning was from the records of the temple. Japs translated them, and we were surprised to find that the translation closely corresponded to the first chapter of St. John in our Bible, and the second reading corresponded to the first chapter of Luke. After the reading, we asked if we might get our Bible and compare the versions. They readily consented, and, with the assistance of Jas, we made the comparison and were surprised at the similarity. We had scarcely finished when the breakfast calls sounded and all went in. After breakfast, we prepared to descend to the village and, for the time, the comparison left our minds. When we arrived, we found quite a number congregated from the nearby country, and were told by Jas that they were nearly all shepherds that pastured their flocks in the high mountains in summer, and the time for leaving the lower region was fast approaching. We were told that such a meeting as would take place that afternoon was always called just before the people departed. As we walked through the village, we met Emil's nephew, and he suggested we go for a short walk before lunch. We accepted the invitation readily, and as we had wished to see some of the country around. While we were on this walk, several places were pointed out in the valley and as being of special interest. The names were translated very closely resembled those of earlier Bible names. But the real significance of all this did not present itself until we had returned, had lunch, and were seated among those that had assembled. There were about 200 in this assembly, when the rest of our friends from the temple appeared. Then Emil's nephew arose and approached two men holding what looked to us like a large book. When this was opened, it proved to be a box in which the form of a book. He selected a package which consisted of flat leaves like those of a manuscript. Then the box was placed on the ground. The package was handed to one of the men. He opened it and handed the first leaf to Emil's nephew. When the reading of each leaf was finished, it was handed to the other man who placed it in the box. The reading proceeded, with Jast as interpreter. It had not gone very far when we saw that it bore a striking resemblance to the book of John, carried out much more in detail. Then followed one similar to that of Luke, then one similar to that of Mark, and the final was like that of Matthew. After the reading, the people collected in little groups, and we, with Jast, sought Emil, for we were curious to know the meaning of it all. We were told that these records were read each year at the meeting, and that this place was the center of the country where these scenes were enacted long years ago. We remarked the similarity of these happenings with those chronicled in our Bible, and were told that there was no question but that some of the earlier scenes as chronicled in our Bible were taken from these records. But those happenings of a later date, such as the crucifixion, took place elsewhere, the whole reaching its climax in the birth and life of Christ. The foremost thought of it all was the search for the Christ in man, and to show those who had wandered away from the ideal that the Christ lived in them as he always had. Emil went on to say, it does not matter where the scenes were enacted. It is the underlying spiritual significance which we wish to perpetuate. We spent the balance of that afternoon and the next day making comparisons and taking notes. Space will not permit the inclusion here of these notes and comparisons, but the spiritual meaning will be understood by reading these chapters mentioned above. We found that the father of Emil's nephew, who read the records to us, was born in the village and was a direct descendant of John, and that it was the custom for some member of the family to come to this place at this time and read these records. The temple above us was the one where Zacharias and John had both worshipped. We found that our friends wished to be on their way, so it was arranged that Jas would stay with us and the others would go on. We finished with the records the next day, then left the temple early the morning after. Although the hour was early, nearly all the villagers were up to bid us God's speed. So I think the takeaway from these chapters 19 and 20 are that every child is born good and perfect, that there are no bad children, and that there are two ways to be born into this physical plane. The one, as made famous by the Bible, is immaculate conception, or the conception of a life through the non-physical, and then the material birth, the semination of the egg by the sperm, then the child growing in the womb. Now I'll make a distinct statement and say that both child grows in the womb, whether conceived by immaculate conception or whether conceived via the mortal means. And science is gonna, if a scientist or somebody, some academic were to watch this video, they'd probably just write me off right there at that statement, making, and this book for that matter, talking about immaculate conception. I have gone in and done research on how one is immaculately conceived, and if you want to laugh at what I'm about to say, or if you want to tune out at this point, that's perfectly fine. There's somebody out there that this message is going to directly resonate with, and they are going to know in their heart that it is the truth. So the way that my research has revealed to me through which Immaculate Conception takes place is that a man and a woman are copulating, making love, having sex, however you want to put it, in the astral plane. So you take your physical body and you put it into meditation, or you rest, and you take your consciousness and you enter into the astral plane. I like to refer to it as like density 3.5. It's the place in between the physical and the non-physical. Kind of like a no man's land, not somewhere where you really want to stay, but somewhere where you can visit and where you can receive communications from higher density, higher consciousness very easily. So the way that Immaculate Conception was explained to me is through density 3.5, through the astral plane. People copulate. So let's take Joseph and Mary, for example, both masters of their trade, not peasants as the Bible had put them, and they did this act. They copulated in the astral realm and invited Jesus' soul to then take up residence in Mary's womb, where which a physical body was grown for him to then move through the world with. There is no way to actually know that this is what happened. If I were to tell you that I know this is how Jesus came to be, you could write me off, and I would hope that you would, because I would be making authoritarian claims on something that I have no direct knowledge of. I'm simply relaying to you what my research, the fruit that my research has borne unto me, and the thing that makes the most sense to me and resonates most strongly with my heart. So that is my commentary on chapter 19. You can either be born immaculately or you can be born physically. Both birthing process result in the same thing. A physical body is birthed through a woman and comes unto the world. The masters in chapter 19 make the distinction that it is much easier for the child who was born in the non-physical way to realize their divinity, to manifest and bring forth the Christ within, as Jesus did. It is very rare that human beings are born in this fashion, because it takes two very highly, you could say, ascended or adept meditation practitioners in order to perform the sexual feat in the non-physical realm. So nonetheless, the other way for realizing the Christ within oneself and bringing that forth to the world and being a blessing unto others and to oneself is through holding fast, fixating on the Christ, fixating on unconditional love, the divine perfect form of the human, and then making it your life's mission to bring this forth, to achieve this. And I've read stories and accounts that Jesus also had to hold fast to the ideal of Christ in order to bring it forth. He had to fixate his mind on it. And, you know, if he'd have just gone his whole life and never had known about the Christ, it would have been a much different, probably, outcome, so to speak. But nonetheless, a mortal man, or a mortal woman for that matter, as the masters have made clear in here, can fixate on the Christ, which is the embodiment of unconditional love, and then bring that forth into the world, thus being a blessing unto the world and unto themselves. The final thing that they talk about here that I'm not sure necessarily needs a ton of commentary is that they're outlining that a lot of the story that comprises Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John occurred in the Far East. And what I'll say with that too is that it's highly believed that Jesus did travel after the age of around 13 over to the Far East and did spend time with these masters, whether they be Hindu or Vedic or Buddhist. You know, he traveled around, he absorbed their teachings, he realized that the Christ was within, and that is really the kind of timeline that I hope you're on as well. I hope that you're on that timeline where you recognize that your source of salvation is not an external thing, that what will ultimately save you and bring you closer to unconditional love already resides and exists within you, and that it is only a matter of concentration and focus that brings that out, that makes that available not only for your use, your benefit, but ultimately for the benefit of others. And as the books are going to go on later to talk about, having the direction of mind to bring about the Christ so that it can be most of service to other people is what expedites the process. So if you put your focus and your conscious intent and you use your willpower to bring about the Christ, you will expedite the process exponentially if you are doing it because you want to be a blessing unto others. Vain reasons and self-serving reasons aren't necessarily going to get you that much closer, and they are more or less indicative of a Cain timeline where you're making certain sacrifices, but you're ultimately doing them only for yourself, and they're not necessarily, as in Cain's case, that pleasing to the Lord, so to speak. Because I don't believe in a vengeful or wrathful God necessarily. I believe in karma, and I believe in law, and that the universe is based upon laws, divine laws, and that if you violate those laws, there are repercussions for that. So essentially what I'm getting at here is that the Christ lives within every single one of us, and it is the ultimate source of salvation, and it is up to each and every single one of us to bring forth that ideal and actualize it. In doing so, you're a blessing unto others, you're a blessing unto yourself, and you're a blessing unto the world. The service to self timeline, wanting access to supernatural powers such as the ability to move through walls, the ability to know what others are thinking, the ability to materialize substance out of the universal and into the material, virtually out of thin air as others would perceive it, or to relocate your body from one geographic location to another using the power of thought. If you're doing those things because you think they'll bring you personal gain, or if you're after this embodiment because it seems like it would serve you in some kind of self-serving, dare I say selfish way, you're not necessarily making the proper sacrifices, which is to give up your ego, which is to give up your grip on worldly gain, worldly possession. That would, if you had done those things, ultimately bring you that much closer to divinity. And you're going to end up on that service to self timeline where you are going to be disappointed with the outcome, where you're going to be ultimately disappointed with the response that you get from the universe. You may enjoy some gain for a while, some material possessions and things of that nature, but ultimately in the very end you're going to have this kind of void inside of you that you can't seem to fill adequately. You'll grasp and you'll search and you'll attempt, but it won't ever be filled the way that it would be filled if you were going down this timeline in pursuit of this embodiment of the Christ energy so that you could be of service to others. In so doing, you are fulfilling the promise of karma, that for every action there is an equal or opposite reaction. That is basically karma in and of itself. It's the result of what we do. So if you are seeking to serve yourself, ultimately that's going to come back on you. The self is a mortal conception. It's a finite thing, and you cannot get infinite sustenance. You cannot get infinite reward. You cannot get infinite sustainment, joy, prosperity, abundance, life, bliss out of a thing that is meant to end. With all of that, I want to reassure you that on this timeline we are all on currently, everything is very good. To include the current situation with the coronavirus, to include the current situation with world monetary systems, world financial systems, world economies, everything is very good, and everything is working out exactly the way that it is supposed to at all times. And we will truly see a day of abundant prosperity, infinite bliss and joy. It's right around the corner, everybody. So hold fast to your meditations, hold fast to your service to others, hold fast to raising thy consciousness and being more loving, and I will see you tomorrow. Namaste.